Did you ever have a conversation like this when you were young? Someone would say to you, "Did you eat the last of the ice cream and leave the empty carton in the freezer?" "Well," and you'd say something like, "Well, that's a pretty deep subject for a shallow mind like yours." No? That was pretty sophisticated humor where I came from. And by the way, I was smart enough never to say that sort of thing to my parents. My older sister maybe, if I had access to an immediate means of egress. Anyway, the passage from the Gospel of John is one of the best known in the Bible. As soon as we started, you were all going, "Oh, yeah, it's the woman at the well." And it is rich with verses to explore and lessons to learn. Here is some background information before we take a deep dive into the passage itself. We start with a little geography lesson, so you have to use your imagination. Think of a stretch of land roughly bordered on the top, the north, by the Sea of Galilee, and on the bottom, the south, by the Dead Sea. And those two bodies of water are connected by the Jordan River. The land, then, can be divided up into three sections like Neapolitan ice cream. The top level is Galilee, the bottom level is Judea, and smack there in the middle is Samaria. Are we all kind of clear? In our passage, Jesus has been teaching in Judea, or right before our passage, Jesus has been teaching in Judea, but gets into some hot water with the Pharisees and decides to head back home to Galilee to let things cool off a little bit. Now, he could have taken his disciples, again, use your imagination, he could have taken his disciples, crossed the Jordan, headed up the far side, and then recrossed the Jordan back into Galilee. He could have done that, but he chooses not to. Instead, he takes the more direct, shorter route right through Samaria. Now, Jewish folks and Samaritan folks generally didn't like each other much. If you want to know more, go back to your Old Testament and read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Suffice it to say here that there was a feud between the Jews and the Samaritans that had been running for, let's say 500 years. It was a religious feud, and it was a political feud, and it had turned downright nasty over the years. If you remember the parable of the Good Samaritan, when Jesus tells that parable, people would have been super surprised to hear Jesus make the Samaritan the hero of that story. I digress a bit. Now back to our passage. As I said, Jesus decides to take the most direct route home, and that means traveling through Samaria. In particular, they go to the village, he and his disciples go to the village of Sychar. Sychar's claim to fame is that one of the patriarchs from way back, and I mean way back in the Old Testament, Jacob, had built a well there. And even after all this time, people were still able to draw water from that well. It was sort of the old faithful of wells, if you will. Jesus and his disciples come to town around midday, when everyone is either working or eating lunch or about to settle down for an afternoon siesta. The disciples head off to the nearest 7-Eleven for a big gulp and some turkey jerky, while Jesus hangs out at the well. And along comes a woman, and the weirdest thing happens. He talks to her. By all that was proper and expected, this should have never happened. You may ask why. But let me ask you instead. Why would Jesus talking to the woman at the well be so unusual, even to the point of it being scandalous? Help me out here.
She's a woman.
She's a woman. She's a Samaritan.
She has a bad reputation.
She has a bad reputation. We'll talk about that in just a second. So she is a Samaritan woman with a bad reputation. And who is this other character? Jesus, who's a what? Jew. He's Jewish, and he's a man, and he's a rabbi. So let's put those pieces together. Yes. So it's right here. Yes. First, Jesus is a Jewish man, not just any man, but a rabbi, for goodness sake. And the woman is a Samaritan. Well, she's a woman. And there are rules of propriety that simply made such an interaction between them taboo. This should not have happened. But here's the real kicker. It's almost certain that the woman at the well was a practitioner, as they say, of the world's oldest profession. Do I really need to spell it out more than that? Since there are children present? Now we can figure that out about the woman, not only from the actual conversation that takes place with Jesus, but the fact that she is there getting water at noon. It's in the heat of the day, when there are no other more, quote-unquote, respectable people there. This was the one time of day that she could go out and perhaps not be scorned and rejected by her neighbors. So here we have the odd couple. Jesus and the woman at the well. Rabbi Jesus begins the conversation by asking her for a drink of water. And before this lengthy passage is over, the woman has told everyone she knows that she believes that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. And what has happened is that the villagers have asked this Jesus and his disciples to stay for 2 days with them and to teach them. I contend that of all the miracles that Jesus performed during his ministry, this may be among the most miraculous of them. Like I said, there are plenty of lessons for us to explore here. One, obviously, is that Jesus cared enough about this person that he was willing to risk a lot, including the welfare of his disciples, I might add. Notice how they didn't have a committee meeting to do this. Jesus just said, this is the way it's going to be. Jesus cared enough to break through all the social barriers that time and people had erected. He offered her acceptance, and he validated her humanity, and he even challenged her to live a better and more faith-filled life. In more than one sense, Jesus offered her salvation. What I also like is the woman, and I wish we knew her name. Did you notice we never get her name in this? I wish we knew her name. She stays right in the moment with Jesus. She does not shy away from this remarkable and challenging situation. She is open to the amazing possibility that she's encountering the Messiah, and this Messiah cares about her. And then she is brave enough, risking all that scorn and ridicule, to go out and tell everyone she knows about this amazing teacher and her interaction with him, her encounter with him. Now, because I'm not a particularly brave person, I almost always admire when others are. And here we have two heroes to be inspired by, which I say is pretty awesome. The last thing I'm going to mention this morning is how the villagers were able to set aside their distrust and wariness of this rabbi and his band of followers and invite them into their homes and into their lives. Even if it's just for a couple of days, that's significant. And we get the impression from the gospel writer, from John, that some of these villagers were early converts to the Christian faith. They had an encounter with Jesus, and they believed that he was, in fact, the Christ, the Messiah. Can you imagine how disruptive that would have been to their lives and their families and their social status? The answer is very, by the way. This brief conversation, it's not brief when you read it aloud, but brief conversation between the woman at the well and Jesus of Nazareth had ripple effects that changed the lives of many people. I think it's important. I think it's an important part of our own faith journey to be open to those moments, as simple as they may first seem, in which God really shakes things up. It's good for the soul, or it's well for the soul. Well, it's still a deep subject for shallow minds, don't you think? Amen.